opinion polls suggesting large, sizable majorities supporting Trump's isolationism and transactionalism. So what does that do to the world? So this book is about, so one segment of it is about what happens when a great power implodes or loses its predominant position in terms of influencing different regions of the world. And, mind you, this is not a book in the tradition of declinism. Now, there's a tradition of American declinism going back a long time. People have been predicting it will be overtaken by somebody or the other, and that it will lose its vitality and all that. Now, this is not about capabilities. This book is not about, nobody can question the fact the United States still has the most dominant military in the world, right? And economically, it is neck and neck with China, depends on how you measure it. It is still in the top 2 in the world, economically, in GDP terms. So I'm not talking about a decline in those hard material capabilities. I'm here talking about a different phenomenon, a withdrawal and a decline in influence, geopolitical and geostrategic influence in different regions of the world. Something that needs context and that needs actually study of what is happening in different regions of the world. So that's the other half of the book, where I'm actually looking at, I picked 4 regions that have historically had significant American presence and, shaping of the regional orders. And this started with from World War II itself, and then consolidated throughout the Cold War and even after the post-Cold War period. Now with Trump, here comes someone who says, I want to build schools in Alabama, not in Afghanistan. What are we doing 8,000 miles away? Why are we wasting resources on protecting all these capable allies like Japan or Germany and so on? So there is this tendency for the US to now pull back, and that is backed, even if, let's say, Trump loses the November election, even if he's replaced by a Joe Biden or somebody, I don't see this undercurrent going away. So in that sense, this is a kind of a retreat, however you want to call it. And the retreat is not so bad. See, I have a problem with the Western liberal critics of Trump who are saying that if we retreat, there's going to be chaos, anarchy, and all these countries and different regions of the world where we used to be the governor or the policeman or the sheriff are just going to fall apart. I'm saying no, we don't need this governorship model anymore of any so-called liberal hegemon. And I also challenge the Western liberal assumption in this book that American hegemony is good for the whole world and that it produces global public goods and regional public goods. So I show from the point of view of powerful emerging power centers in Asia, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. Stuti mentioned the 4 cases. That from their point of view, it's always been a mixed bag. America has not always been, a kind of unqualified blessing that's somehow propping us up and making us great or pulling us up to fulfill our ambitions of becoming great powers. Actually, it's been a mixed picture. And in some cases, American liberal hegemony actually prevents the rise of emerging powers beyond a certain level. Because the moment you rise beyond a certain level, according to the liberal international order, it's a threat to the United States itself. So they would always give carrots and sticks, but also maintain pressure on allies, partners, strategic partners in different regions of the world. So I picked 4 countries that can be called partners / allies of the US, but which have ambiguous feelings about this transforming world order we are seeing. With Corona, I just want to close there, and we can have a longer discussion. With the Corona crisis, perhaps this is now even more compounded because America, as you know, has come out in a very dysfunctional manner to be able to solve its own domestic, health crisis. With over 100,000 deaths, it's looking like one of the weakest links in the chain of transmission globally. Of course, that's a domestic concern, but it will have ramifications for years to come. As we know, they're calling it a once in a generation or once in a lifetime or once in a century crisis we are in. So it will constrain the United States more. There are people saying that Trump is going to go out fighting now as a diversion from the domestic failure to prevent the deaths and the infections. There's this talk of a new Cold War. But let me end by one point, please, which is the whole question of China. Because the Western liberals often say, if we step back, then the Chinese are going to gobble the whole world. The Chinese are ready and positioned to replace the US. Wherever we step back, the Chinese are ready. And that means that, an illiberal hegemon is going to arise on a global scale. Now, I challenge that because from the point of view of the emerging power centers, Brazil, Nigeria, Turkey, India, I could have added Indonesia perhaps. There could be more cases from other regions of the world. The point I'm making is, from their perspective, they are not willing to concede ground to the Chinese just because the Americans are stepping back. We have our own ambitions to be able to provide regional public goods to regional leadership, or to use our Prime Minister's phrase, "Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas," as a way to build, a long following across the global South, especially in our extended neighborhoods, where we can provide order. We don't need a global policeman, be it a Chinese or an American. So in that sense, it carries on in our tradition going back to the non-alignment movement and so on. But at that time, we were not thinking of leading, we were just thinking of surviving the clash between superpowers. So today, we are in a different era, and I don't subscribe to the old tropes of non-alignment, because here it's not about surviving. We have the capabilities, some of us, and provided we have the right leadership, and I do have cases in this book where I believe we don't have the right leadership, like President Bolsonaro of Brazil and President Erdogan of Turkey. But overall, what I'm saying is that we can do it, and we don't need a sheriff or an external or an extra-regional enforcer of order or of a geopolitical balance of power. So I'll rest my case there and we can come back. Thank you.
So you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Sreeram, for that introduction. You have really laid out the basic argument in your book. I think it's also topical because we're in an election year. We're going to deal with many of these issues, so it'll be interesting to see what types of trends or patterns emerge. So let me at the outset compliment you for dissecting Trump and the phenomenon he represents, which is really the central figure in your argument, the way you've set it up. He's unraveled American politics and foreign policy, yet we see there's resilience left in the structures of power and interest in the US establishment. So we'll come back to that sort of two-track presidency, the way you call it. I like that sort of, rather than making it a linear breakdown in that consensus. I think the other point that your book makes is you have certainly called out the liberal world order for its ambiguities for the non-Western family, so to speak. I think there's a tendency in India, in the Indian discourse, to romanticize the pre-Trump era as if we were a part of that liberal order. As we know, we struggled on the margins for that order for many decades. And even after the so-called nuclear deal and our belief that we had entered the mainstream, I think we still were on the margins of that order. So if you look at the Indian discourse, the foreign and actual foreign policy over the last decade, we've seen our own revisionism already in place, even before Trump comes in. We never really accepted the liberal orders as a standard template. We said we were to want to reform it, revise it, and maybe even challenge it in certain areas.
Hello.
I also found this particular parallels that you drew in previous episodes of US political history. So we've had previous instances of this Trump-like phenomenon, right? I mean, we saw it in the 1930s, as you bring out briefly, when there was a more radical isolationist sort of challenge to the FDR's progressive internationalism. We saw it even in the immediate post-Cold War period in the early 90s, when an America First wave came in among the conservative Republicans who sort of felt that now this global ideological struggle is over. Let's focus on things at home. Let's focus on bringing back a cultural pluralism and domestic well-being. But yet, in each of those instances, the liberal internationalists, globalists, sort of overcomes that quite easily. So, what makes it different this time? I mean, that's an interesting question. That how did Trump succeed, or that phenomenon? Well, the reasons I think aren't too complicated. We saw a failure to deliver the goods, as you said, failure to supply public goods. We saw the global economic crisis in the last decade. We saw a series of costly military failures that, combined with the economic disruptions, have really changed the American political landscape. And at the same time, you have this rise of the rest that's been happening for the last several decades, and it's sort of manifesting more overtly in the last decade, so to speak. So you have a combination of a global balance of power, and you also have an inability of the United States to maintain this unipolar role, which is actually quite a brief period. So Trump sort of sneaks in there almost at the point of an electoral revolt. And let me just since we are now entering a phase where we're beginning to see where these two patterns in American, to simplify it, the nationalists and the globalists, or the new liberal internationalists versus the ones who want to reindustrialize the US economy. I sense, even in the last 4 years, the two-track presidency, as you bring out, the tug of war seems to be slightly underplayed in the way you have laid it out. I think when you look at Trump's overall policy, foreign, domestic, economy, it was clear even before he entered the White House that the establishment was not going to roll over and accept the Trumpian worldview. We saw it with the investigations. We saw the series of national security advisors that were displaced. We saw it with the Russia intervention campaign that was launched. So there was really an attempt to sort of hem in Trump and his particular attempt at disrupting what was seen as the dominant consensus. So I see on geopolitics still very much the impulse for military primacy very much in place in the US establishment. On the economy, he's been more successful to resist the globalist discourse, certainly, and even on actual policy. We've seen it in terms of global trading arrangements and the kind of transactionalism that's actually not just single instances, but we see it across the board, including with India. So, but on military interventionism, I think there you do get a sense that at every moment, you look at Syria, Iran, North Korea, these mini crises that played out in the last 4 years. At every moment when we felt we were at the cusp of a US intervention, and actively encouraged by the media conversations at the time, the media elite, the establishment elite, you see the White House restrain those forces. So there is a sense that he's responding to his base, which abhors wasteful expenditure and blood on faraway military commitments. So I think that part is not likely to be reversed, even if we were to lose. I think there is now a change in how American people look at in America's military commitments across the world. Of course, there's a lot of room for maneuver still, every presidency will have, but the ability to sort of wage or intervene at will simply doesn't exist. And we see that, in fact, where it's moved into the shadows, you're seeing a lot more covert activity. So that part hasn't stopped yet. And we see parallels like that even in the 1970s, when after the anti-Vietnam sort of furor, a lot of US geopolitical activity moved away from the mainstream into the shadows. So we might see more of that. And then you sort of come full circle in this Trump presidency, right? And now we're told we're on the verge of a Cold War with China. I somehow find it difficult to set that against what we see or what Trump is arguing for. How can you wage a Cold War when you are a nationalist and an isolationist and a retrencher, right? You are saying that you want a multipolar world with self-serving great powers scrambling for spoils. And yet you have a parallel discourse that's obviously coming from the US establishment that wants to wage a Cold War. So I think that is going to be a very interesting tussle, because that comes really at the heart of including what we're facing today, right? I mean, we're facing mini crisis on our frontiers. We're facing an Asia that is again being asked to sort of really contemplate the idea of a collapse of Sino-American stability that had lasted for 4 decades. So these are really big questions, and we still don't know which side the needle could swing in that. And I think you also cautioned rightly, and I like this quote of yours. It would be a mistake, you say, to get carried away by Trump's aggressive tone on China. A thorough evaluation of his record shows he has more bark than bite. I think that's a fair assessment. If he were to come back, in which we shouldn't rule out, I certainly see the ability for deal making, transactionalism, along with competition, to shape the China policy. So it's going to be an interesting there. Let me also just say this point that the globalists in the US establishment, I'm focusing on China here, the globalists are still themselves not completely united in their China policy. They know they want competition, but they're not quite sure how to go about it, and they haven't really entertained the costs that particular grand strategy will entail on business interests, private sector interests, and even on the ability for US military posture to engage in a Soviet-style Cold War strategy. So I think we might even see on China policy, paradoxically, Trump having a lot more room for maneuver if he were to return to office. That could be an interesting thing, because we are forecasting how Delhi will sort of approach this. Let me briefly close by coming down to your central sort of thesis and implication for India. So I think what you are suggesting is that the idea of bandwagoning with an unpredictable and nationalistic US is unappealing, which makes sense. The specter of China's rise is disconcerting, true. So what are the options for India? You are suggesting that we can fill the power vacuum in the region by forming certain multilateral groupings under the banner of resisting the Chinese, as you call it. Now, this is an ambitious plan. Some of it is viable and sensible, what you talk about, filling up that power vacuum, developing a regional posture. But I found some of the facets underdeveloped, and I think that's where we can get into that conversation. What are the Indian ideas, norms, regional visions, multilateral institutions that you truly are going to bring to bear? I mean, it's one point to say that there's a power vacuum. How do you actually fill up that power vacuum? It's, as we know, power, as you've rightly described it, is never really about brute physical material strength. It's about a buy-in to the ideas. So what are these Indian ideas? You can't just say that because I'm around, I'm going to fill up that space. We're seeing Indian neighbors not buy into Indian ideas, partly because we've not been successful in articulating what is that vision for this alternative regional order to come into place. So that's one. But I'm also, I think, skeptical of this third force idea. Even though intuitively it's appealing to nationalists, it's appealing that, yes, we can develop our own be sort of the Jupiter with these satellites around us. But is it really possible to work around two powers, the United States and China, who constitute 40% of the global economy, have strategic interests in the subcontinent, and are still pillars of the Asian geo-economic landscape? So that's one. Are we also able to cohere the middle powers who have actually, despite a common sense of identity, let's call them this non-aligned, post-colonial sort of episodes that they've had in the past. They want their space. They don't want to be constricted by larger great powers. But each of them have their own unique predilections, their domestic identity problems. Is it possible to truly create those multilateral coalitions? Again, what will be that glue? We know from the history of the non-aligned movement that they never really got going, even though they had a common identity. So how do you bring that about here? And finally, I somehow feel that the material interdependence or the reality of 4 decades of Sino-American, not only the bilateral relationship, but what it's done to globalization, to unentangle ourselves from that and expect others to do so, including our neighbors, I think that's, and without having the material power to say that, okay, you plug into our political economy. So I think this, we sort of maybe getting ahead of ourselves here in sort of raising a hand and saying we are ready to be that sort of great power counter option for others who don't like those two. You know, so I would sort of argue, and I'll close there, and then is that why not go forward in further developing our multi-directional, multi-vector foreign policy, whatever you want to call it, by developing an even more sophisticated variant of this existing strategy, which is having proximity, close interactions with all these major powers, contending amongst themselves and developing advantages from all of them. Yes, it won't be an easy task, but we've done it in the past in the First Cold War, which was even a more vociferous and a much more dangerous struggle where you had sort of clear lines of demarcation and spheres of influence. I think here you're dealing with a more entangled world. And isn't the onus upon us to stabilize the power transition rather than just merely to exploit it for very, very small tactical gains, which is what we will end up with? So I think there's also a question to be asked, what should be India's role in this power transition happening, where you have China as an uncertain contender, unwilling to take those responsibilities, the United States reducing its footprint, but still very extractive while it retreats? Why shouldn't we helping bridge these worlds in specific sectors and issue areas? So I think that's really an opportunity for India's foreign policy. So let me stop there and ask Pramit to give us his insights and comments.
Sure.
So maybe 10 minutes or a little longer.
Yeah, 10 minutes is fine. I have three broad areas that I'll comment on, some of which have already been touched by Zorawar. First, I think you had a sentence in the book where you talk about the fact that internal domestic equations are going to will be determining even more than normal policies of governments across the world, and that's clearly evident in the United States, and I fully agree with that. Ultimately, what you really need, and what America had until recently, was one of its greatest strengths was that there was a bipartisan consensus on its foreign policy, which has now more or less broken down. And that results in the fact that policies now change with administrations. And in the case of Trump, they can often change within the administration and can also now have different levels in where Trump goes one direction, and as Zorawar said, the establishment will go another direction. The U.S.-Russia policy, for example, is the most striking example where Trump loves Putin, but the rest of his administration hates him. So as a consequence, the policy effectively goes nowhere. And I think that's absolutely crucial, which is one of the good things about this book in particular is its strong emphasis in trying to understand the nature of what is happening in American politics today, and in effect, therefore, why the consensus in Washington on foreign policy has broken down. I think there was a very good paper, which I don't think was in your index, but by Thomas Wright in foreign policy just after Trump was elected, where he looked at Trump's policies and statements on foreign policy going back to the days when he was just a real estate developer. Because he used to go on television and talk about anything. When I was a college student in America in the 1980s, he was always on TV holding forth on anything. So Wright goes back as a political scientist and checks everything he said. And he says, actually, he's been very consistent. This man is a 19th century Republican. He would be exactly what William Howard Taft or all of these unknown Republican presidents have dominated America back in the turn of the century. He represents exactly their school of thinking: mercantilist, isolationist, unilateralist, America first in almost every element, anti-immigrant. So this is an America that in effect has returned, if you wish, under Trump. And it is not a Republican position insofar as the Republicans have become or became after World War I and definitely after World War II, became supporters of free trade and an internationalist structure very strongly governed by realpolitik, but fully recognizing the benefits of building rules-making bodies around the world for the United States. And free trade, in many ways, was the key shift that took place with the Americans, with the Republicans. And that is many ways also where they overlapped very strongly with the Democrats. In fact, the Republicans were the free trade party of America, and it was the Democrats who were always the skeptics because of their trade union trade union politics of their coalition. So as you're right in actually saying that Trump is not a normal conservative American. He is a populist. He's a right-wing populist, and as you correctly say, he overlapped very strongly with Bernie Sanders. And I think the only area I felt that you talked about it, because you quote Branko Milanovic and so on about the inequality issue, and I wish it had been developed a little further, but if you look at the figures, and I think at the core of where Sanders got his support from, and where it overlaps with Trump, and I should add overlaps to some degree with Obama, because Obama was also in many ways a micro revolt, if you wish, within the Democratic establishment. And it's consistent that it is white working class Americans, or the working class being defined as white Americans without college degrees, who were the core support. A lot of them flipped for Obama, a lot of them voted for Sanders, and a lot of them also voted in favor of Trump. And that core of about 40% of America's electorate remains to this day consistently with Trump. And as you correctly point out, this base, in effect, is violently or skeptical, should we say, of free trade, of America's general engagement with the rest of the world. And it's their sons and daughters, if you wish, who have gone into battle more often and have died on behalf of the United States. They're the ones who provide the bulk of the soldiers who go in on the ground, skeptical of America's overseas thing. But the real core of it, if you look at it, is that this group in the population, America, has seen its life expectancy, its overall income, its standards, and finally its standing in American society declined dramatically over the past 30 to 40 years. It's been one of the sharpest declines. In many ways, this group is now almost indistinguishable from black Americans, traditionally the poorest element of American society. And it's interesting that a lot of these voted for Obama, simply because they saw him as a non-establishment figure. So I think it's very important now to understand domestic politics, and I'm very glad that almost your entire introduction, a large chunk of your introduction, is exactly about this, trying to get an understanding of the domestic political forces that are driving the United States today, and why, and I would agree with Zorawar, and I think you mentioned this as well, that this is not going to change. Even in a Biden administration, there will be an inability of the American system to consider the kind of global hegemonic role that they've had in the past, one, and that incorporates not just on the willingness to consider military interventions, which I think are now largely passé, except for very few cases where American interests are overwhelming, but a willingness to underpin the global trading system, the global financial system, and a whole bunch of other areas where I would argue definitely America has provided public goods, because a lot of the economics of the world today runs smoothly largely because the Americans have provided the backbone to it. And that is now slowly going to go away. So I think that's one of the most important elements of this book. You have to get the domestic politics to figure out where the foreign policy is going to go. And that was not true in the past for the United States in recent history. It is true today. But I would also emphasize, and I think you bring this out to some element, especially in, I think, the Nigeria and I'm not so familiar with the politics of Brazil, but definitely a bit of the Turkish side, that it is also a factor as to what the middle powers, if we are ever going to do anything, you have to understand our own domestic politics. Do we have a consensus on foreign policy? Do we have a consensus on our international engagement? And there I'll go to my second element now, and this I agree with Zorawar. I am very skeptical about middle power cooperation, because there is no consensus in most of these countries as to how much they are prepared to do on foreign policy and what the nature of their foreign policy is. I have been hearing as a journalist now for the past 4 years, Germans, Japanese, South Koreans, some Brazilians, Turks, I've gone to Turkey 5 or 6 times as part of a Track 2 strategic dialogue. I've gone to South Korea for the same purpose, and Japan, representing India. The same thing, middle power cooperation. Can we work together? And the answer is, so far, zero. We have not been able to accomplish anything together. The Germans proposed maritime security in the Indian Ocean. They ran away from it themselves. We tried development cooperation with the Japanese. You cite the Africa Growth Corridor, which is dead. It does not exist. The Indo-Japanese, the growth corridor in Africa has not come up. There's one road is all that has arrived, and that's nothing else has happened, and most of that has now been abandoned. Our attempts to cooperate on a bilateral level for aid development with the Japanese, let alone with other countries, have really struggled. It's extraordinarily difficult for middle powers to cooperate. We don't have the resources. We have struggled to align our standards and even our goals. And then finally, our mental strategic landscape. India cannot really see itself as a power in Latin America. The Brazilians cannot see themselves as a power in the Sea of Japan. The Japanese are reluctant to extend their power almost anywhere outside the Western Pacific. So it's I'm hoping that, yes, that will happen, and potentially under the pressure of China and the withdrawal of American power, this may change. But for the time being, I don't see that happening, and I think quite the opposite. Most of these middle powers, including India, spend a lot of their time trying to keep the Americans still involved. The whole concept of the Indo-Pacific, the Quad, is largely predicated on the idea that we have to try to anchor America in the Western Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific area, because without America, our ability to provide any form of coalitional structure with the Japanese, with the Koreans, with the Australians, with anybody, Indonesia, will not succeed. I remember one time being part of a delegation, speaking to the number of ministers from Korea, and I said to them, what would you like for India to do? This was last year. They said, we believe your prime minister has a good relationship with President Trump. Our president doesn't. Trump doesn't like President Moon for whatever reason. Please tell him, please use whatever authority you can. Tell the Americans, please don't leave Northeast Asia, because if they do, we will have war. It is impossible for us to maintain stability in this region by ourselves. So we'll see where this goes, but my sense is that it's going to be really difficult. And the economic side, this is just on the strategic military security side, where you could see some type of cooperation. On the economic technology side, almost impossible. Look at the battle over 5G. There are only 2 or 3 countries with 5G capacity which are not in the developed world. There's actually only one, South Korea, arguably I would argue it's a developed country, but otherwise none of us have 5G, full stop. We have to depend on a developed country, a Western country of some variety, for that technology. So the standards being set for this, and these are standards for internet, which will then develop into internet mobility, electrical vehicles, autonomous vehicles, the entire set of standards that are built around 5G, which will dominate the digital world. We don't have the capacity. No middle power does. I'm skeptical on the middle power idea, but I think it's a good idea only in the sense that my sense of where you're going to see the world going is a fragmentation of the present hegemonic structure. And that's what you're seeing when America talks about disrupting supply chains, where China says that we want to ensure that the dollar dominance in the international financial system comes to an end. Is that we'll see a fracturing of this. And then within those fractures gives the middle powers the capacity to both either, as Zorawar said, join different groups to maximize your positions, but potentially do other things on our own. But for the time being, I'm skeptical on that point. And I think at the heart of it is not just capacity, but as I've mentioned, that our domestic politics in most of our countries does not lend itself to this. And as you've given yourself 2 examples, both Brazil and Turkey, 2 middle powers, Turkey grossly overambitious. this entire neo-Ottoman foreign policy that Erdogan has now driven his country into disaster. He's gotten himself stuck into civil wars in Syria. He's got himself into battles first with the Russians, now allied with the Russians, but against the Israelis. His original policy of a zero-problem neighborhood, in which I will have a perfect relationship with everybody, has now become a full-problem neighborhood. He has no good relations in his neighborhood at all. Every country other than Russia right now, that is, and even there the relationship is extraordinarily tricky, he has a very hostile relation. At one point, Turkey had no ambassadors in any country that was neighboring it, if I remember correctly, because his relationships were so poor. Brazil, as you've mentioned, another country that has gone from one extreme left position to an extreme right position, and the result has been chaos both externally and internally. So middle powers, I think, have a long way to go. The only area I think that I would find some degree of difference is when you talk about your chapter on India-US relations. And I'll end with this. Your assumption in a number of the policies is that India has been extremely unhappy with Trump. And I don't deny that the Indian system has found Trump to be extraordinarily difficult to handle at times. But overall, my sense is when I've talked within the government, they find Trump to be actually, the Trump administration has broadly been positive for the Indo-US relationship. A lot of the smaller battles that you've mentioned, whether the S-400, Iran sanctions, have actually been negotiated internally between the US and India in a manner that has not bothered the Indian side. So when sanctions are imposed in Iran, we opposed it, but we basically said we still need to buy oil from Iran, some amount, and the Americans said, okay, just reduce the amount and that's good enough. And that's basically what we've done. S-400, they made a bit of noise, but in the end they said it's your choice, you can go ahead and do it. And so we've had our issues, but an Afghan withdrawal, for example, is not a Trump policy. This is a policy that goes back to Obama. Obama has tried 3 times through his entire administration to get out of Afghanistan. Trump has continued that line. But that is a consensus policy now in America. It's the Pentagon that fights to keep there and some other elements of Washington. But this is not a Trump policy. And we have assumed, I would argue, within the Indian system that the Americans will withdraw at some point. Our only game is to delay that. We're not really expecting anything to happen. You're right to say that Trump, and you're correct to say Trump is an unusual character, and his attempts at mediation. He has, if you look at the list, he has offered to mediate on Kashmir a number of times. He has offered to mediate between the UK and the European.
Just a minute left.
Okay. Yeah, and between the UK and the EU, he's offered to mediate in the Middle East, and he's offered to mediate as recently between India and China. The whole point of that is to win a Nobel Peace Prize. He has no strategy. Okay, Obama won it, so he feels he has to. And I've talked to people in his administration. They said it's just total nonsense. He wants to mediate in anywhere he can that he thinks he can get a Nobel Peace Prize, but he doesn't want to do any work to actually do the mediation. So therefore, don't take it seriously. And you'll notice his latest announcement for US, India, and China. Neither India or China even bothered to say anything. They were just, okay, forget it. It's just him again, talking again. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pramit. I actually just pick up on that point. I found it actually interesting why the Indian establishment generally is comfortable with Trump. I think that patronizing tone of the past, and also the idea that America was going to remake and socialize these rising powers. I think that part, because that's been abandoned, it sort of gives a sense of a new form of creativity to these rising powers. Now, whether they use that opportunity to remake themselves and craft those roles, but I think the earlier template used to be that this is the world order, you plug in, these are the terms, right? As you laid out, Sreeram, in your book, that the norms were not non-negotiable. Now, it's a normative contest, really. And that's where that negotiating creativity comes in. And maybe in certain regional spaces, India can actually have a say in co-creating certain spaces and institutions. So that's an interesting opportunity. Stuti, I'm going to hand it over to you and let us have your views, please.
Thank you so much, sir, and thank you, Professor Chaulia, for once again sharing the book with me, because you've already given me the hard copy, which is spending its lockdown in my office room right now.
There,
So thank you so much for that.
the audience can see it. Yeah.
Thank you so. Yes.
And it's
Thank you
now
so
back
much for
available in
that.
hard copy. Yeah.
So, as has been already said, that the book is looking at it talks about the rise of four emerging powers, Brazil, India, Nigeria, and Turkey, and the space that they can occupy as the United States starts to withdraw from the international system. And I am looking at it in the current context as well, and I find it very meaningful, especially as the US now threatens to withdraw from the WTO. And this is just one more organization to the list that has already been set out by President Trump from which he wants to withdraw. So I feel that, yes, it is indeed a very opportune moment for these emerging states to step up into the international arena and show that they have the ability to lead. And this, as Professor Chaulia in his book has explained, would be based on cooperation that they are able to generate. But my question really, and to some extent that was answered, also looked at by Professor Singh and Mr. Chaudhuri, is the US really withdrawing from the world? I mean, we have this view of, President Trump, who's very nationalist. He's looking inwards and he's looking at the US, how to make America great again. But as the author has himself pointed out, the 4 case studies that he has taken, they also to a large extent have very similar heads of states and heads of governments with very similar views. They are all putting their national interests in the forefront, and they're very proud to announce this not just to their domestic audience, but also to their, foreign counterparts. So it seems that the idea of nationalism is more prominently now placed in foreign policy. Now, whether this is a phenomena that came about as a result of President Trump, or it's something that is coming about as a result of what is international politics and economics right now, that states are looking inwards. I think in this situation, if the 4 emerging states are likely to behave in a way similar to the US, I'm not very sure how far they will be able to step up to the challenge, or how independently they would be able to step up to the challenge. And this is, again, like I said, Professor Chaulia, you have pointed out that these 4 emerging states that you've identified have their own very domestic, but very regional challenges that hinder their growth within the region. Now, I feel that the US that way has been extremely lucky. It has a geographical advantage. It essentially has 2 borders which are very peaceful. I don't see very many, non-traditional security threats to it right now. It is a hemispheric power. So it is generally controlling the foreign policy, economic policy in the region it is. But the 4 emerging powers that we're studying from your book are, they are not just competing with other powers that want to use regional powers to lead the region in these respective areas, but they're also competing to some extent with extra-regional powers in their backyards. And I think like India, Brazil, Nigeria, Turkey are to some extent going to be looking at the US to help them. They're going to be vying for the support of the United States to reach this position of regional power that you're talking about. And I really like this thought that you have put out, that they're very unlikely to play a second fiddle to China or the US or to any other country. But I find that interesting because I don't really think that these 4 countries right now have the military, economic, or the soft power to really embrace the role that you have laid out for them. I think it's very ambitious, and I feel that to some extent there would be, they would be continuing to play a second role to the regional powers, to US, China, and take their support and continue to grow. And the other I have is that in these regions that we are talking about, Latin America, Middle East, Asia, Africa, I feel that the US, these regions continue to use US military, US dollar as a fail-safe option. I mean, given a choice, the United States continues to have that trustworthiness that no other country right now has. And this is something you yourself have brought about in terms of, countries looking at the US rather than these 4 countries preferring to partner or ally with the US rather than with any other country, especially China. And with respect to Turkey, and you have, brought about this issue of how it does not have the support of the regional nations, like the countries which surround it. So my question to you is that if it has that kind of trust deficit, and to some extent, I would say because of the competition these 4 emerging powers face in the region, there is a little bit of trust deficit that they face. How do you see them actually bringing about these kind of cooperative elements and, bringing these countries, other countries in the region to their forefront? How do they bridge that gap that they have in terms of the trustworthiness that they have? Now, what I find is that when we're looking at the US, and I think that a lot of people have been talking about how President Trump is, brought about transactional nature to the US foreign policy. It's now very transactional, and he has you give me this, I'll do this for you. My personal assessment is it's a misconception or a label that has been given to him. And to the frustration of people, he has actually taken it as a matter of pride and, not of criticism as it was intended to be. And as Mr. Chaudhuri said, he wants to win a Nobel Prize. I think he also wants to actually make sure he's very, very different from all other presidents that the United States had. So you had President Obama as the first Black American, coming from a very humble background. He's competing against that legacy. And he wants to be this very different, people-centric, one of them kind of president. And when you talk about him being transactional, he's just taking it as that is an extension of me. And if that makes me very different from other presidents, then so be it. I will be this transactional. But the question that comes to me is that I feel that the US foreign policy has been transactional before he arrived in the White House. And it's just to a large degree the transactional nature of the policies or him making sure that they are viewed as transactional that has actually caught the eye of people. Because I feel that presidents before him have done very much the same thing, but with a lot of sophistication and maybe in a diplomatic manner, rather than being very brash about it like he has. And I'll give you an example of that. Now, if you look at the, point of view, or you look at it from the point of view of Cuba, Venezuela, or Iran, the weaponization of the dollar, I think they would say is U.S. very transactional foreign policy towards them. When we are talking about the increase of the NATO budget, that has been like one of his points forever. President Obama was also trying to do it under his administration, but in very polite and diplomatic manner. And then you have President Bush, who famously said, you are either with us or without us. So I feel the context was very different for all these 3 presidents, but the underlying message continues to be very much the same. Now, I feel that is to some extent, like I said, because he wants to be very different. He wants to be president who, was apart from everybody else. And he's also, to some extent, the first president of the United States in a truly social media age kind of thing. And this, I feel, would be something that other presidents who come to occupy the White House will also be social media savvy, would connect to the people, because President Trump has set a precedent. But it is his way of connecting to the people, making them feel part of the establishment of the swamp that he's trying to drain out, and decision-making, making them feel empowered, important in this. And as an elected representative, I think he is following a public opinion that may, I don't think it really supports his views on when he is criticizing or saying things badly about other heads of government or states. But it does, Dr. Singh and Mr. Chaudhuri said, support the idea of U.S. withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan and Syria, of, why is there more focused national viewpoint, more economic development for the United States. And does really question why U.S. money and troops have to be sent out to develop or to defend other countries. They really are at a crossroads and don't understand why this is being a requirement of US foreign policy. And I feel like, as you have in your book also pointed out, that the US goes through these periods of withdrawal from international arenas. It has done that in the past, that in the 1930s and before it has done. And some would even say, as the world becomes more peaceful and there is not a war around for the US to get involved in, and it does tend to look inwards. And I think that is what is essentially, to some extent, happening right now. It is looking inwards because the world is relatively at peace, according to the United States. And while this is jarring right now, because I think of the extent of US influence, before it has done it, when its influence, I would say, was largely within its hemispherical sphere, Latin America, then it extended to Europe. Today, the United States is everywhere. Its influence is everywhere. So I think when it's starting to withdraw from these multilateral organizations, you have President Trump saying, I don't want this and you have to do this. It is more jarring because that influence of global supply chains, economics, it connects us so much today, much more than it did in 1990s to 2000. It is connecting in 2020, we are much more connected. So this withdrawal has become slightly more jarring. But I think as he mainstreams the idea of a very macho, powerful America that does not bow down to others, there would be a continuity of this with the next occupant of the White House, whether he's Republican or Democrat, because it would risk losing face in the domestic arena. That entire America is a powerful thing or a powerful nation that does not go down to anybody has to be continued. And to some extent, I am not very sure how much the US in the near future will be able to accept the changes that President Trump himself is bringing about in the international order that it has set up, built, strengthened, and led for so long. So my conclusion largely is that I feel that the US is, I think it is spending a lot more in its military. Its defense budget has gone up. And while it is withdrawing from Afghanistan and Syria and other hotspots, there is a slightly more US presence in terms of the number of ships that are patrolling, the number of port calls it is doing, such things. Then you have the financial system and the dollar, which continues to guide the international market. And in current pandemic situation, everybody is looking at the US, treasury bonds. My colleague tells me they are the most important and most stable of all bonds there. And these are two pillars of American strength, power, and hegemony. And as long as they continue to be sound and stable, I think US leadership is likely to remain, maybe in perhaps a diminished capacity, but it will continue to be a leader. And it is in this leadership role that the emerging powers have to find their space, or continue to be second fiddle or kind of match up to the US is something that we have to, I think, see in the future. But for the present, I think the US leadership is going to be power. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Stuti. Wonderful comments there. I before we sort of open it up to the audience, I thought we could just maybe have a conversation on some of the themes that sort of are forward-looking and striking. So one of the puzzles, Sreeram, for me, and maybe Pramit, even you can sort of weigh in, is what is it that, this is on US domestic politics, what is it that is obstructing the transformation of, we know there are these massive imbalances, right, in the domestic political system, economic, social. Trump was one sort of reaction to that, a populist reaction. But what's stopping an FDR type of a rise in the US system? Because for me, it seems that until those, it's frozen. The structure is frozen. Trump is only making a dent on the margins, if you really look at it. I'm a little bit of a skeptic. I still see the establishment playing Trump. They're relying on Trump to maintain authority on many issue areas. If we look at US policy across the board, international, it's by no means a clear sort of delineation. Right? So that two-track presidency that you talk about it, what's stopping that? Why is the system frozen? Because one of the things about American history was you always had cycles. You had sort of a liberal return. Maybe we saw it with JFK. We saw it with FDR. What's happening now? Why is the Democratic establishment? I mean, even Joe Biden. I mean, let's face it. Is this anything even remotely of an FDR or a JFK or really trying to sort of restore the domestic order? Because until you do that, this lashing out and playing this role of primacy and retreating, it's going to create such a schizophrenic American presence in the world. I mean, we haven't even seen the disruptions. I mean, partly because Trump is certainly sort of held the reins close, on these on this military machine, but it can be unleashed in the future, and you could see irrational acts coming out of what is a relatively declining power. Right? Let's face it, in a relative sense. And will it decline peacefully? I don't see that. So domestic politics. What's that factor? Why is it frozen?
Yeah, no, I think Zorawar is a good point, and I in the book outline a kind of a crisis of capitalism, on the crisis of the capitalist order, and the fact you're right that be it Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden, surely these are not the best or the most attractive alternatives that the American system could throw up. So the reason it has become frozen or is not showing enough mobility and dynamism like before in terms of leadership or solutions to socioeconomic problems is because they're caught in a deep crisis of capitalism. I mean, Stuti was talking about the dollar, and so was Pramit, the primacy of the dollar and all that. But a lot of this can come, unglued. I mean, you look at the history of global currencies. The only previous global currency was the British pound sterling, and it did vanish over time, and no longer it's now part of a basket and cannot be called a global currency in itself. And a lot of this goes back to the point about, the lack of internal mobility. And I do point that out, Zorawar, at some points in the book. People have lost faith in the idea of the American dream domestically. There was this so-called Horatio Alger myth. Those in the audience who know the American history, the idea that, anyone who's enterprising and who's hardworking, and does not need any kind of patronage of anybody, and in this free market system will rise up, become rich, and do well. Now, that mobility has been frozen since the 1980s, since this whole globalization thing started. So I think I see this, in a kind of like a Marxist analysis. The politics is reflecting the ossified nature of the socio-economic processes. And to a great extent, these leaders, like populism is not necessarily the solution to these. Like many of you have been saying, it is actually probably exacerbating these crises and these inequalities and the lack of mobility. So I think it'll have to get a lot worse before the United States can get better. And maybe I'll just take a couple of minutes, Zorawar, to respond to few of the comments, not all. One was the question about, and Stuti had a very important point, that and you were saying that too, and so was Pramit, that, my agenda for middle powers is very ambitious. And that, I'm overshooting and expecting a lot from these people, these countries that are rising and emerging, but cannot fill the shoes of the US. Yeah, in fact, I'm not really making the claim that any of them can individually become global powers. In fact, my view is that there cannot be any global powers anymore. No. So what I'm talking about is they have defined spaces where they have influence, and that is where they have a chance now. The vacuum being created by Trump need not be filled by the Chinese. What I'm saying is that, or the Russians for the fact in the Middle East. And what I'm saying is that these entrenched regional powers, they don't do what we call bandwagoning. I mean, Pramit gave the example of South Korea, Japan. None of these can be, I don't classify these as, emerging powers. And in fact, I define emerging power by one very central political trait. It's not just they have big populations and, ambitions. It's also the fact that, as per the international relations theories, they don't bandwagon to more powerful states. They counterbalance. I mean, that is the central point. I mean, in fact, I do give the example of South Korea, and I show that why they cannot wean themselves off from total dependence on the United States. But India, for that matter, or Nigeria, cannot be classified in the same category, or Brazil until Bolsonaro came about. So I think the counterbalancing versus bandwagoning, that is the dialectic within which, and the other dialectic you already mentioned is the two-track presidency within. And the last point, Zorawar, before I hand over to questions from the audience, is the US really withdrawing, and will it go back to interventionism? Now, that, I think, is, a historical question, an empirical question. Only time will bear out. But what I'm saying is that it depends on the threat perception, and the external threat perception. So fascism, communism, and then the jihadist Islamism, these three were seen as existential threats, and they could mobilize the leaders, liberal internationalists could mobilize the US society to go for war, to go for, full spread out, global tentacles, presence, military bases, without even having to justify it. You could just say, we are fighting terrorists, we are fighting communists, we are fighting fascists. Now, we are fighting China. I don't think that's selling enough. It is not that kind of a diabolic threat as per the ordinary Americans, certainly not the people who are Trump's base. In a way, Trump is already satisfying them by saying, I'm doing a trade war with China. But like I said, that's not enough to contain China, right? There is no multilateral coalition building. So the point about all the middle powers relying on the US to solve their strategic dilemmas, I'm skeptical about that. I cannot rely on this kind of US, and I don't see that happening into the future. So even if you don't bandwagon, and maybe you're counterbalancing against China or against Russia in the case of Turkey, or against France in the case of Nigeria. France has a neo-colonial presence in West Africa and has been hobbling Nigeria's rise. So each of us have our strategic dilemmas. But the real question is, and we have relied on the US in the past, I am saying that we will continue to want the US to be involved. And in fact, that's the last point about Trump being not so bad for India. Like Pramit was saying, yeah, it's not Trump per se, right? It's the permanent deep state. We have worked with it, and Modi has worked with it. And in the last 3 years, 4 years, we have been made. And I give the example of Jim Mattis and others in the permanent deep state, so to say, whom we are continuing to try to carry this on. But I think at some point this will end, or it will decline. It will reduce its efficacy, this strategy. And therefore, we have to come back to self-reliance. Therefore, we have to come back to believing in ourselves. I'm talking more not like a social scientist, but like a politician here. We have to believe in ourselves that we can lead, So this book is a normative book. It's not just, an objective statement of realities. I mean, surely you're all pointing out to the objective limitations of middle powers. But there is something beyond this. We can break through, we are in a global depression again, the first time in almost 100 years. So, looking forward, I think, and the capitalist crisis, I see this as prolonged, and you will see that you started in 2008, now it's come back in an even bigger way. So I think about this as a big churning, and what will come out of it if we are not prepared for it, if we are not, battle hardened for it, and if we just sit back and say, well, we cannot do it, or we have to still rely on the US. I think that's going to constrain and limit the possibilities. And to use an economic phrase, the production possibility frontier, we have not yet reached. None of the middle powers has reached it. And my book is a call to, action for these countries that, come on, wake up, let's do it.
Thank you, Sreeram. So I thought I'll open it up to the questions. So we've got some folks who posted their questions. I'm going to try and sort of combine them because there are a lot of overlapping themes. I just found it interesting that this point, I think what you mentioned, that taking that materialist analysis, that I felt the US political system could externalize its imbalances it's done it literally for the last 50, 70 years, that it didn't need to engage in those domestic readjustments. Let's call it a redistribution strategy, because it could externalize it. Globalization gave it massive amounts of resources to redistribute, distracted attention, kept a sense of under siege, that the Cold War mentality. I think if that breaks down, which it seems it's going to be costly to wage Cold War, right? If you're talking of a multipolar balance of power system, you're reaching where the domestic container can no longer be externalized. You've got to make those adjustments at home. So I think that's going to be the tipping point in the US political system, and it'll be fascinating how that plays out. So let me open up. So one of the questions we're getting is what will be the impact of COVID-19 generally as this crisis is playing out in multiple levels on US domestic politics in terms of, let's say, this tussle between the globalists and the nationalists? How will it impact US-China relations and the roles they play in Asia? And then what does it mean for India? So do you want to sort of briefly go over those levels, and maybe we can hear a bit from Pramit as well? And then we can move on. So let's try and keep this a little more snappier so that we get an opportunity to address some of the other, because we've got plenty of people tuning in.
Yeah, sure. So Zorawar, first thing, I wrote an opinion piece recently about a month ago, saying that the COVID-19 global crisis is actually an inflection point. I see this as a historical turning point, with the US at its dysfunctional worst, with China discredited because for obvious reasons the virus emanated from China. Even if it was not intentional, it was a colossal failure, political failure of the Chinese Communist Party. And therefore, and sadly, I'm sad to note that the hunch I had in the book that Bolsonaro was going down the wrong path is now being proven again, because he has totally mishandled the pandemic. But Nigeria is holding up. It's okay. It's not so bad. India is holding up. We have not done a bad job in mitigating the public health crisis. And going forward, I think Turkey actually, again, due to faulty leadership and misguided, vainglorious President Erdogan has also misplayed its hand. But overall, that's the important variable. See, what will set apart ordinary middle powers from extraordinary ones? The ones that will continue to languish and the ones that will leap up and lead. My feeling is a lot of it depends on the quality of leadership and the vision and their ability to take their domestic populations along without too many divisions. So I think this is the pandemic is opening up a new era. I mean, many people will say the IR theorists will say military, economic, soft power. Well, you tell me, what is the soft power of China today after the coronavirus? You tell me, what is the soft power of the United States after coronavirus? I think, and the polls and all will reflect this. But there's a global sense that these big powers have failed quite badly. So I think this is the moment, really, for the middle powers to step in, fill the vacuum, do small group cooperation, provide the public goods. We are doing our own bit in our region. Similar other countries could do that if they're able to sense that this vacuum, this is a moment that if I let go now, I'll never be able to catch up or never be able to ward off the Chinese encroachment, So fill the vacuum, and we need to step up, be more proactive. I have given some suggestions for each country, how they can be proactive in the book. But I think, it's a work in progress. I mean, this is we are talking about a very contemporary, ongoing thing, right? Rather than something that's in the past, which we can coolly and dispassionately analyze. So this is a passionate work, and I'm saying, come on, let's rise up to the challenge.
Yeah. Stuti, do you want to weigh in on some of this? And then I'll hand it over to Pramit to give a sort of an overview of domestic politics as well in the US.
Yeah, I think to a large extent that the pandemic that we're seeing has kind of changed everything. Like I said, it's probably the first time that global economic and social activities have come to a complete standstill. And I agree with Professor Chaulia that it is actually a moment for all these countries to kind of look at how they can step up into the leadership role. But obviously there are issues to it, and I think one of the most prominent ones would be all of these countries today are more or less at the same place in terms of how their economies are going to be affected by this pandemic, how their social life is going to be affected. So I think to some extent it's going to take some time for these countries to reflect on how this pandemic plays on them domestically. And as these countries start to build up their, near-term economic stimulus packages and talk about how they're going to change the way things are going to be done, I think it's now time for most of us to look at a larger picture of how this pandemic is going to affect us in, let's say, the next 5 years, 10 years. What is its consequences going to be long-term and how to plan for it. And also, as Professor Chaulia and even Mr. Chaudhuri said, there is this now need for technology. So I think that technology gap is something that these emerging states need to really fill up really quickly, not just to get the leadership, like Professor Chaulia was talking about, fill in the vacuum that the US is slowly leaving behind, but essentially ensure that these countries which have now got a setback due to the pandemic are able to cover up that gap domestically as well. So I think a technology push would be something that this pandemic is going to force us now to look at. How do we do indigenous technology? How do we do more innovation in that time? And I think it is going to have an impact on how we also interact with other nations. So do we now see the US really looking at China very differently in terms of 5G technology? Would it be able to force other countries to view China very differently on these matters? Then again, on infrastructure, would foreign policy now change? Would countries look at Chinese financial aid much more differently than they did before? So I think these are new questions that are going to be coming up. And essentially, the COVID is not going to just change the way economic policies of countries change. I think it's going to also affect, to a large extent, how they play out in their foreign policy in some time to come. And I think we now need to have a slightly long-term view of how this is going to affect.
Thank you. Pramit, can I combine this idea of this post-COVID turning point in a question that sort of affects us all, Asia's geopolitical order? So we're familiar with this idea that the United States' presence in the Indo-Pacific, Western Pacific was always a dual track one, right? It had a military presence, it had security commitments, but they were also backed up by deep economic linkages. And it was because of those linkages that you had these security commitments. And now we're seeing a breakdown in that dissonance where you are not retreating, but certainly reorienting economically outside the institutional architectures, RCEP, others that are coming into place. But you're very much inside the tent in the security commitment. So at some point, this breakdown could really alter and how would it play out? I mean, this is fascinating because can the United States sustain a role only based on military commitment? Because at some point, you'll have a president in the White House who will say, why should I bother about protecting the Philippines or these frontline states? Because my stakes are very different now. I have a global economic posture, focus on the Western Hemisphere.
It's a good question. We don't fully know because right now, I mean, what you're describing, that suddenly an American president saying, why am I committing blood and treasure to a part of the world that doesn't really contribute very much to, is exactly what happened in the Middle East. Starting with Obama and continuing under Trump, America has largely now said the Persian Gulf is really on its own. And its commitments are there, but they're shrinking quite rapidly. And if the Israeli lobby wasn't there, it'd probably be down to zero by now. So yes, will the same thing happen in the Indo-Pacific? So far, no, simply because their economic relationships with the Indo-Pacific countries, particularly, are still the biggest after the EU. Arguably now actually greater than the EU. They really fastest growing segments of the U.S. economy. Depend on the markets in the Asia area. So what you're seeing from what Pompeo and other members, Esper and other members of the American system, the Trump administration, as well as what's coming out of people who are in the Biden team, Jake Sullivan and so on, in their writings, they seem to envisage, one, they all agree, the consensus is between both the Republicans and the Democrats, is decoupling must happen. In other words, America's relationship with China must be massively reduced. And that is happening now on a very rapid front. It's not just about the trade. Chinese FDI into U.S. last year dropped by 95%. Simple things like academic exchanges are now being ripped apart. Technology agreements, all of that is now dead. So what has Pompeo been publicly saying and what has he been privately telling to countries like India is that, okay, if this decoupling is going to happen, we're going to see this giant reorientation of supply chains, investment structures, and a digital hub structure that will be independent. So the internet has already been sort of severed, if you wish, to some degree between the US and China, and that's going to now spread. You have your WeChat, you have your WhatsApp, you have each single sort of digital structure has been now paralleled between the US and China, and so on. So my sense is that what the Americans will say, we still will remain an Indo-Pacific country because it's economically still too important for us. There still remains a broad consensus, I would argue, going from what I'm reading and what we're hearing, that this is the future of America, both economically and technologically, which they know is the real sort of coin of power that America has. But they need to cut out China, and that is going to be extraordinarily difficult. But if you look at the economic guidelines that, for example, Xi Jinping has been issuing, he seems to accept that this is going to be the future, that China is going to face this problem, and China will therefore have to set up its own structures. And so you're going to see, broadly speaking, I would argue on the basis of what they're saying, not so much of what they're doing because it's too early to tell, is you're going to see two competing networks of finance, technology, trade, investment, even immigration. All of this package is now sort of being created in the Indo-Pacific. And countries like India are going to have to decide not so much as whether I have to be part of one or part of the other, but if I'm going to put 60% in one and 40% in the other, or 70% in this and 30% in the other, and then play the game accordingly. So that's going to be where I see this all going. And the pandemic has only accelerated that process because it's been able to generate an enormous degree of anti-Chinese sentiment in the West and in America. And it has also allowed a lot of countries, even France or Sweden and so on, have come out and said, we can't depend on pharmaceuticals, medical devices, biotechnology on China anymore. So another set of supply chains are now going to be severed along with them, and this is now going to incorporate things like artificial intelligence and so on, all of which are now deeply integrated into healthcare. So that's where broadly I see this going in terms of at least what their governments are saying and what they're saying in private, and corporations are now thinking. How long it will take to play and whether it will succeed is a different story.
Thanks. How much time do we have, Stuti, for Q&A? You're on mute.
So you have another 5 minutes.
Okay. Sure.
Let's do rapid fire.
Let's do a rapid fire. So one of the questions, okay, let me just quickly fire out some of the questions which seem interesting because they're more sort of closer to our periphery and a region. So one question being asked is, what do we make of Trump's new neutralism generally in bilateral disputes, the way he's behaving? I mean, we saw it yesterday's tweet as well on the India-China crisis, but we've seen it generally on India-Pakistan, elsewhere. I mean, this is a part of a pattern, right? It's not... the other thing is, how do you see... I mean, people generally want to get a sense quickly on what does a lighter American footprint in South Asia mean generally for this region and its order? I know these are big questions. So this is going to be like just swift sort of responses. And finally, I found this question quite interesting. Somebody asked, should India join in US adventurism if it were to be asked to do so? What would you say to that?
Okay, Zorawar, I'll take up the question about this neutralism and the mediation offers. I mean, we've seen these seemingly quixotic ones coming from the White House, and we've gotten used to it in a way. But I show in my book that if at all Trump does show interventionist tendencies, be it diplomatic or military or intelligence, or it has to do with domestic political factors. So, for example, so if at all you so when it comes to these mediation offers, one has to wonder who's lobbying him back home among these various ethnic groups that are part of the US body politic, and trying to encouraging him, prodding him in one direction or the other. Now, the lighter footprint, I'll simply say that, we are already seeing that they're going to put down to 8,000, they say, from 12,000 in Afghanistan. And I think that will progressively be downsized. The latest reports say that Trump does want to pull out and come down to zero by November, but he's being held back by, the so-called deep state or the Pentagon. But it's a kind of Vietnamization kind of situation. Imagine 1974. We are in Afghanistan today like that, They're on the verge of pulling out, and they're just trying to work out a face-saving way to exit after the failure of the last 20 years. So I think what will replace the lighter footprint, or in the absence of any footprint, is that vacuum. We all talk about vacuum, but who's India? And we cannot ride piggyback anymore on assuming that the US will continue to provide these services.
Thanks, Sreeram. Any closing remarks? And here I want to endorse Sreeram. I think the essence of your thesis is we should be prepared for a dramatic transformation in the American role in the world. I think there's no doubt that's happening. I think what you're also asking us to is philosophically re-examine this assumption that do we need a single superpower to provide order in public goods? So I think in that sense, you're absolutely true. And let me add, from a theoretical standpoint, this idea of hegemonic stability theory that we've all brought into, that for the last several centuries, it was one single Western superpower, and they kept sort of passing the baton on to each other, right? In a culture, from one single cultural realm that they emerged. And you need, and without those powers at the helm, we were told you cannot have order, so it was, but we are facing a world today where if power has been redistributed to Eurasia and Asia, which it has, right, in a material sense, even ideationally, how can we go back to, or go to the hegemonic stability theory? Because these rising powers, even collectively, can simply not provide public goods at that global scale that we have been accustomed to. So we have to contemplate the idea of complete change in the very order and its setting. So, but coming to just this last point, I think we in India, and we've had these norms in place that if we support exclusive, block-based, or norms emerging from just single states, I think that is going to be a dangerous game to play, and that's going to create even more chaos. So I would actually say let's revive what's already inherent in our discourse when we say an open, plural, multi-civilizational, maybe somewhat fragmented, regionalized, decentralized. These are the kind of norms which you have, at a sense, a global common consensus towards the big questions of ecological security, strategic stability. But other than that, it's going to be the regions and closer networks, geographically contiguous, that will have to partake in that order transformation. So, for India to sort of just be leaning against the major powers and just going its own way is not an option. But I would say that maybe there is a little bit of a bridging role possible. It'll be complicated, but on certain sectors and certain issue areas, I don't see why India, given its own size, can shape the conversation on US-China relations. I mean, we don't have to make that choice. If we are going to be a big market in, let's say, certain areas, we can ensure that the normative shifts on those issue areas, whether it's 5G or others, is a part of our conversation, how we want it to be. So it doesn't have to be a Cold War fragmentation or breakdown. But that's up to, of course, policymakers to make those bold choices and creative strategies. Stuti, I'm going to hand it over to you.
If you permit me, I'll simply say, spheres of influence have been damned as a bad thing under the liberal international order, because there was only one global sphere of influence under Pax Americana, Let us
Absolutely.
prepare, whether we want to call it spheres of influence or not, if we want to tiptoe around the term, we find it uncomfortable and there are shades of empire in it, let's not use the term, but I envisage the spheres of influence kind of model. We should have a world with 7, 8 or 9 power centers, definitely not one,
Sure.
and I don't think we are with G2 either.
Yeah. And I would just add that those spheres of influence, because they are so entangled with each other, to say that they're going to be sharp breaks, I think that's where we have to avoid that. Because many of those regional settings will not have the material wherewithal to close themselves out. So Eurasia can. Let's not pretend. We can be on the margins of Eurasia. They've got the natural resources. With China, they've got the technology, the demographics. So we've got to be careful on our choices. We have to be part of this dynamic economic center that's emerging close to our frontiers. And at the same time, we want the old Western geopolitical family to also be engaged in this. So it's going to be a tricky act, but to say that you're going to be leaning against both, I think that's going maybe a step too far. But let me hand it over to ICWA, Stuti, to close off this wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much. So all I have left is to say on behalf of the Council, I thank you all for joining us for this book discussion, for sparing your valuable time and giving us these insightful comments. I also would like to thank all our audience members for their patience and attention that you have given us. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you in our next webinar.
Thank you. Thank you.